to brothers and sisters in Christ. It was the best of times, and it was the worst of times. Have you ever heard those words? Anybody? Have you heard of them? Tale of the Two Cities by Charles Dickens. It was the best of times. You know, the Industrial Revolution was on, and things were really happening in society, but it was also the worst of times. Children were exploited, and wages were at a starvation level. It was the best of times, and it was the worst of times. And that would be an apt description of what's going on in today's gospel. I can't imagine that today's gospel is a favorite of anybody's. Now, let me remind you that when this gospel was first written, it was the best of times. You know, listen to all that's gone on in the previous weeks. Jesus has been crisscrossing back and forth over the Galilee Sea. And he's been preaching, teaching, he's been healing people, he's been raising their dead. Jesus has been truly a miracle man. And the crowds are responding. Huge crowds, great crowds, follow him wherever he goes. If Jesus goes to one side of the Sea of Galilee, the crowds run after him. If he goes to the other side, crowds run after him. And they bring their sick and put them in the marketplace, and they beg Jesus, come and heal them. Jesus is a popular preacher and prophet. It's the best of times. But then it's also the worst of times. In the midst of this ministry, where Jesus is teaching and preaching and healing, this grisly news comes to Jesus and his disciples that John the Baptist has been beheaded. It's a gruesome story. It's a story of political intrigue. It's a story of how people hold grudges against one another. It's really an awful story, a horrible story, but yet it tells us about the cost of discipleship. I can remember Dietrich Bonhoeffer once said, if anybody would follow Jesus, he bids us to come and die. And of course, Bonhoeffer experienced those words literally. He was hung in prison. But it's true. At that time, at the time of Jesus, yes, he's popular, but, you know, it's going to cost you something to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. In today's gospel, John the Baptizer was the one who had prepared the way for the coming of Jesus. You heard that story during the Advent season, how the Messiah is coming, and John would go out and he'd preach and he'd teach and he'd tell people, God is coming into our present. Get ready, prepare your way, prepare for the coming of the Messiah. That's the message he preached. But he also approached the king, King Herod, and he preached to King Herod, and he challenged him. And he said to the king, you know, you stole your brother's wife. This is wrong. This is immoral. This is not legal. And of course, you can imagine they took offense, especially the wife, Herodias. She took offense at John the Baptist. She held a grudge, and she really wanted to kill him. But the text says she could not. Why? Because for some reason, Herod kind of liked John the Baptist. It says in today's gospel, he really liked to listen to him. And not only that, it says the king protected John the Baptizer. He said that he believed that John was a just and righteous man. That's what the king said of John the Baptist. Well, you can imagine when somebody in the royal court holds a grudge, the story isn't finished. And it surely isn't finished at this point. Even though the king liked John, one day the queen, Herodias, had an opportune moment. They were celebrating the king's birthday. His daughter came in and danced, and apparently everybody was pleased. The king was pleased, the guests were pleased, and the king makes this promise. Now, be careful what you, when you give your word. The king says to this girl, ask whatever you want, up to half of my kingdom. Ask and I will give it to you. He was so pleased with her dancing. Well, she consults with her mother Herodias, who holds a grudge against John, and what do they ask for? That gruesome request. Give me John the Baptizer's head on a platter. Now, when that word comes to the king, he is aggrieved. It even says in the gospel, he didn't like this request, but he's going to grant it. Why? Because he thinks he has to keep his word. He's made this request, this promise publicly, and he doesn't want to disappoint the daughter or the guests. He wants to keep his word. I think if you were put in that situation, the best thing would have been back down. Don't make a promise that not only you can't fulfill, but don't make a promise that's wrong or immoral. The king knew better. He liked John. He considered John to be a holy and just and righteous man. But yet he gives in and allows John to be martyred and beheaded. He should have just backed off and let John live, but he couldn't, because for whatever reason, maybe he was too full of wine, maybe he was too full of his own pride, but for whatever reason, Herod knew he had done something wrong, but yet he continued and he did it. That's the story of today's gospel. When we say at the end of the gospel, the good news, I have to scratch my head and say, it's hardly good news. It's hardly good news. And so there we have the story of John being beheaded. If anyone would follow Jesus Christ, Christ bids them to come and die. Being a disciple of Jesus Christ was very costly. Might cost you your life. Up there on the screen, I have the story of what happens to disciples of Jesus Christ. What I did was I took the 12 disciples, and then I added John the Baptist, I added Paul, because they're kind of like disciples of Jesus Christ. And then there's a little discrepancy over who the 12 disciples are. You got Nathaniel, you got Bartholomew, which one are you going to count? But anyways, look what happens to disciples. Andrew was hung on a cross, an X-shaped cross. Andrew's day is November 30th, and so his symbol is the symbol of an X, the cross. He was martyred for his faith and crucified on an X-shaped cross. James the elder, there were two James. James the elder, James the less. James the elder, he was beheaded. Stephen, we have that account in Acts, the book of Acts. Stephen was literally stoned to death because he confessed Jesus to be the Messiah. And then next, Barnabas was killed in Cyprus in 61 AD. Saint Bartholomew, skinned alive. Can you imagine how painful that must be? And it seems like they come up with all kinds of novel ways of killing Christians. St. Mark, martyred in Alexandria. Peter, crucified upside down in Rome because Peter did not feel right being crucified in the same position of Jesus. He didn't think he was worthy of that. So they obliged him, and they killed Peter, crucified him upside down. Philip was martyred in Phrygia. Simon and Jude, martyred on the same day in Persia. Thomas, he's the saint of the India church. He was martyred in India. And then James the Lesser, James the Minor, he was thrown off the temple wall. And then when he landed, some 80 feet below, they clubbed him to death. And then, of course, we got St. Paul, who tradition says was beheaded by Nero. And, of course, John the Baptist this morning was beheaded by Herod. Those are gruesome deaths. When Christ calls us to follow, for the early church, he literally called them to come forth and die. Now, you might say to yourself, but Pastor, we don't kill Christians today. Well, they do in some countries. In some countries like Nigeria, Christians do get literally killed. And it does happen in some areas of the world where if you're a Christian, you put your life on the line. But chances are that's not going to happen to you in the United States. But it still raises the question, what sacrifice do I need to make in order to be faithful to Jesus Christ? How do I follow Jesus faithfully? And what must I give up? I am convinced that every Christian in every age must give up something of their own life, something that is precious, something that's important, something that means something to them. But we all have sacrifices to make that can really hurt us at certain times in life. I can remember when I was a young man in high school, I really lucked out. It was, I don't know. I sometimes think I'm the luckiest person in the world. But I studied hard in high school, and I did a good job. And in my senior year, I won a National Merit Scholarship. Well, those were prestigious scholarships that would pay for all your college tuition, and I needed that scholarship. My father, my father died when I was in 5th grade. My mother had multiple sclerosis, and here I got this scholarship. And it would pay for my college tuition. I was walking 6 feet off the earth's surface. And then I got a letter from the National Merit Scholarship people that said, we regret to inform you that because you are going to a religious school to study for the Lutheran ministry, your scholarship is revoked because of separation of church and state in those days. And so I lost my scholarship. Oh man, was I down. But God always provides. That's what I gave up. But then there was this man from Silver Creek, New York. He owned the dairy. He was a member of the congregation I went to, and he came to me and he said, listen, you sit down and with me, we're going to work out a schedule so that you can still go to school. He says, I can provide some money. He says, I got some friends who can provide some money. We'll get you through school. And that's how God provided for me. But there comes times in life when you have to give something up. And it's going to hurt. And it's going to hurt deeply. But the good news is that God provides. Somehow, some way, God provides. And if He doesn't answer your prayers on this side of the grave, He'll answer those prayers on the other side. Because God is always faithful. The good news is God is faithful to His word, even when Herod is faithful to his bad word. God is faithful to His good word, that He loves sinners, that God will take care of us somehow, some way. And so, to sum up today's sermon, there are things you're going to have to give up in life because you follow Jesus Christ. When Christ calls us to follow, He bids us to come and die. Come and die. And when we look at that cross of Jesus Christ, we recognize that it's both good news and bad news. Now, the bad news when you look at the cross is that you must pick up that cross and die. That's the bad news. The good news is you must pick up that cross and die. That's the good news too. God will provide. Amen.